We are now writing the next chapter of one of the strongest industrial developments in Canada's history. As Canadian industries continue to expand, economic output increases, and artificial intelligence speeds up transformation, national electricity needs are projected to rise sharply, expected to double by the year 2050. Because of that, the plan is to expand the power grid on a massive scale. There is one figure to keep in mind for what follows: $22 billion. According to an official government statement released this week, that is the annual contribution already generated by Canada's nuclear sector into the national economy. And on June 22nd, that same sector was positioned as the core element of a new national energy strategy. This shift comes at a critical moment. While attention was focused on trade tensions and repeated signals from Washington about tariffs and economic pressure, Ottawa moved in a different direction. It focused on an area that external trade tools cannot directly influence. The objective has been set to double the electricity grid and reach net zero by 2050. Within that framework, nuclear power is presented as an essential requirement, with no realistic alternative pathway to achieve those targets without it. The discussion does not begin at the starting point, but in the middle of unfolding events, because timing defines the entire situation. Over the past year, Canada has been operating under sustained external pressure from the United States on trade matters. New tariff threats and economic warnings have appeared repeatedly, shaping a sense of constant reaction within Canada. For many in cities such as Toronto, Calgary, and St. John, the situation has felt like a cycle of responding to outside decisions, rather than setting the agenda. Against this backdrop, the announcement of a national nuclear framework centered on energy sovereignty marks a significant change in direction. It directly affects household electricity costs, employment opportunities, industrial competitiveness, and investment decisions across the country. One key point stands out. Tariffs function as taxes on goods that move across borders. They apply to physical exports like steel, lumber, automobiles, and aluminum. Electricity, however, does not operate in the same way. Power generated and consumed within national borders does not cross customs lines, meaning it cannot be targeted by border taxes in the same manner. By emphasizing nuclear energy, Canada is positioning itself in a domain where traditional trade pressure tools have limited effect. To understand this fully, it is important to look at the underlying foundation. Canada did not recently enter nuclear technology. It has developed long-standing capabilities in this sector over decades. The country designed its own reactor technology, known as the CANDA system, which operates using natural uranium. These reactors have been exported internationally to countries including India, South Korea, Romania, Argentina, China, and Pakistan. Within Canada, Ontario generates more than half of its electricity from nuclear facilities such as Bruce and Darlington. At the same time, Canada is also a major uranium producer, with significant reserves located in Saskatchewan. This means Canada is not only a consumer of nuclear energy, but also a key supplier in the fuel chain. It has access to resources, technology, and engineering expertise across the entire system. Very few countries possess all of these components together. Canada does. This structure allows Canada to take a unified position in energy policy and strengthens its leverage in broader economic negotiations. Energy also behaves differently from other export sectors. Most goods must cross borders to generate revenue, which makes them vulnerable to tariffs and trade restrictions. Energy produced domestically is consumed internally and does not depend on external transport in the same way. Canada also exports electricity, particularly hydroelectric power, to the United States. Provinces including Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, and British Columbia supply energy to regions in the American Northeast and Midwest, where it supports local power grids. This creates a relationship where certain areas in the United States rely on Canadian energy imports. At the same time, there are important limitations. Large nuclear projects typically require long timelines and significant financial investment. In many cases, projects in countries such as the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada itself have experienced delays and cost overruns. Because of this, the strategy cannot produce immediate results. It is a long-term approach measured in years rather than weeks or months. The plan reflects a leadership style shaped by long-horizon thinking. The current Prime Minister, Mark Carney, brings experience from central banking roles, having led both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. That background emphasizes long-term stability over short-term political reaction. From that perspective, decisions are evaluated not by immediate political impact, but by whether they remain effective several years into the future, after short-term pressures fade. In this case, investing in domestic nuclear capacity is viewed as building a durable advantage in a sector where Canada already has structural strength. The sequence of events is important. As trade pressure increases and tariff threats continue, Canada does not respond by matching measures in the same domain. Instead, it shifts focus toward a field where it holds internal advantages and where external economic tools have limited reach. This represents a strategic repositioning rather than a direct response, changing the environment in which future economic pressure is applied. This represents a refusal to follow the terms of a game that was already set. The official figures tied to the strategy explain why this sector was selected. $22 billion each year flows into the Canadian economy from nuclear activity. Around 90,000 jobs are supported when combining direct and indirect employment, according to government data attached to the announcement. Any government-provided employment estimate should always be viewed with caution. Independent verification would be necessary before accepting precise values without question. Even with that adjustment, the scale of the sector remains substantial. This is not a symbolic policy gesture. It is an established industry, already operating at national scale, now being assigned a clear expansion mandate. The structure becomes clearer when broken down step by step. First, the United States applies trade pressure in an effort to influence Canadian policy decisions. Second, that pressure is effective because a large share of Canadian exports depend on access to the U.S. market. Historically, roughly 3/4 of Canada's total exports go to the United States. That level of dependence creates leverage, making economic pressure more impactful. Third, the response is not to directly mirror that pressure at the border. Instead, the strategy is to reduce vulnerability by lowering dependence on external trade channels. Energy becomes the central tool in this adjustment. Nuclear power generated domestically produces economic output, employment, and industrial capacity entirely within national borders, avoiding exposure to cross-border trade pressure. The logic follows a clear chain. One condition leads to another, and the outcome is a shift toward internal strength rather than external confrontation. A major development within this strategy is the focus on next-generation nuclear systems, particularly small modular reactors, often referred to as SMRs. These are designed to be smaller in scale and faster to construct than traditional reactors. They can supply power to remote industrial sites, mining operations, data centers, and regional industrial zones. Canada, especially Ontario's Darlington facility, has been advancing development of one of the earliest grid-scale SMR projects in the Western world. This matters because electricity demand is expected to surge significantly in the coming years. Artificial intelligence systems, large data centers, electric vehicles, and broad electrification trends are all driving sustained increases in power consumption. Countries capable of delivering stable, low-cost electricity domestically are positioned to attract the next wave of industrial investment. Canada is attempting to secure that position. However, the sector is still at an early stage. The first SMR units are still being tested and validated. Cost structures remain uncertain and are evolving in real time. This makes the strategy a calculated bet rather than a guaranteed outcome. It assumes that early leadership will translate into long-term commercial advantage before competing nations close the gap. Multiple countries are pursuing similar goals. China is advancing rapidly, and the United States is also heavily investing in nuclear expansion. The outcome is not predetermined. Even with uncertainty, the strategic structure remains consistent. It redirects external pressure toward internal capacity building in areas where Canada holds structural advantages. The broader significance extends beyond Canada. This is not an isolated case. Historical precedent exists in other regions. One of the most important examples comes from France in the 1970s. Following major global oil shocks, France faced severe dependence on imported energy sources it could not control. It was exposed to price volatility and external supply risk. In response, France committed to a large-scale nuclear expansion program. It constructed reactors at an unprecedented pace over the following decades. As a result, around 70% of France's electricity was eventually generated from nuclear facilities located within its own borders. This shift transformed France's energy position. It reduced vulnerability, lowered industrial electricity costs, enabled electricity exports to neighboring countries, and provided long-term energy stability. The core lesson from this example is that energy dependence can be structurally reduced through sustained national investment. It is not theoretical. It has already been achieved in practice. Applying this context to Canada reveals important structural differences. France depended heavily on imported uranium. Canada, by contrast, possesses significant domestic uranium resources. France also relied on imported reactor designs, while Canada developed its own CANDU reactor technology. This places Canada in a stronger starting position than France had when it began its transition. It is not beginning from scarcity, but from a combination of resources, technology, and existing infrastructure. That includes fuel supply, engineering expertise, an established reactor fleet, and export experience. These combined factors materially alter the feasibility of the strategy. Another dimension involves the United States. The American nuclear sector has historically depended on imported uranium to fuel its reactors. A significant portion of that supply has come from abroad, with Canada serving as a key and reliable source. This means that within the nuclear sector, there's also a form of interdependence. The The United States requires fuel resources that Canada supplies. This is a structural relationship rather than a political statement. At the same time, it is important to recognize policy direction in the United States. There is growing bipartisan support for rebuilding domestic nuclear capacity, including investment in small modular reactors and efforts to reduce reliance on imported fuel. This reflects a strategic adjustment within the United States energy policy framework. It indicates that Canada will not have exclusive advantage in this sector indefinitely. The window in which Canada holds a decisive advantage is real, but it is not permanent. That is the clear reality. What separates the two situations is the core of the entire picture. The United States is working to rebuild a nuclear sector that largely slowed down for decades. In contrast, Canada is expanding a system that never fully stopped operating. Canada maintained its reactor fleet, continuously upgraded Bruce and Darlington, preserved engineering expertise, and kept exporting nuclear technology. So when Ottawa announces expansion of a national nuclear strategy, it is not starting from zero. It is accelerating a system that already has momentum rather than reviving something inactive. That difference between scaling up and restarting is measured in years. In a global competition defined by the next decade of industrial electricity demand, those years are critical. This leads to the broader implication for Canada. The narrative that Canada lacks leverage has been challenged by the fact that key strategic assets have been present within its own grid and territory all along. Instead of absorbing pressure at the border, where vulnerability is higher, the strategy shifts focus to energy, where structural strength exists. This changes the central question. It is no longer about survival under pressure. It becomes about what Canada can build while that pressure continues. That shift in framing points toward a different national trajectory. The earlier explanation sets the foundation. Now the outcome becomes clearer. At the center of this is the $22 billion per year generated by the nuclear sector, a figure that reflects an already established industrial base. That number is not symbolic. It represents the scale of an operating system that has now been elevated into a national priority. It is also what makes the strategy difficult to dismiss. It is built on infrastructure that already exists rather than future projection alone. The broader structure can be broken down into connected elements. First, Canada is under ongoing trade pressure, and that pressure is effective because a large portion of exports depends on a single external market. Second, instead of responding at the border level, the strategy shifts toward energy systems, where external tariff pressure has limited effect because value is generated domestically. Third, within that energy domain, Canada holds strong positioning, including its own reactor design, domestic uranium resources, an operational reactor fleet, and early development in next-generation systems. Fourth, historical precedent shows that countries can successfully restructure energy dependence, with France serving as a clear example after the 1970s energy shocks. Fifth, global electricity demand is expected to rise sharply due to artificial intelligence, data centers, electrification, and industrial expansion, increasing the value of reliable domestic power capacity. When these elements are combined, the strategy appears less defensive and more forward-directed. It shifts focus from external pressure to internal capacity building and long-term industrial positioning. In practical terms, this is not abstract policy. It affects economic outcomes on the ground. A long-term nuclear expansion framework implies decades of stable electricity supply conditions. That stability influences household energy costs over time. It also affects where industrial investment flows, particularly for manufacturing facilities that require consistent and affordable electricity. It shapes competition for new infrastructure such as data centers and heavy industry facilities that depend on continuous power availability. It also supports employment across multiple regions, including Ontario, Saskatchewan's uranium sector, and New Brunswick at Point Lepreau, where nuclear-related activity is concentrated. These roles are typically resistant to relocation and less exposed to cross-border trade disruptions. However, the timeline remains extended. Nuclear projects require long construction periods. Small modular reactor technology is still in early commercial development stages and has not yet fully proven its economic scale. As a result, benefits such as job growth and price stability will emerge gradually rather than immediately. This is not a short-term solution to current trade pressure. It is a structural foundation intended to influence the next decade and beyond. The impact of such a foundation often becomes visible only after long periods, when the infrastructure it supports is already in place. Looking ahead, several key indicators will determine the direction of this strategy over the next 6 to 12 months. One is whether the policy is backed by concrete financial commitments and actual reactor construction decisions, rather than remaining a conceptual framework. Another is how the United States responds, particularly as it pursues its own nuclear expansion efforts. The outcome may evolve into either parallel competition or coordinated development. A third factor is how Canada leverages its uranium resources and reactor technology in external relationships, potentially integrating energy assets into broader international positioning. At the same time, it is important to maintain perspective. The United States remains a significantly larger economy with strong nuclear ambitions of its own. The bilateral relationship remains central and deeply interconnected. This is not a shift toward rivalry, but rather an effort to ensure negotiations do not begin from a position of structural disadvantage when domestic strengths are present. In conclusion, the narrative that Canada is primarily reactive is being challenged by a strategy that emphasizes internal capability, existing infrastructure, and long-term industrial positioning. The effectiveness of this approach will depend on execution, not intention. But the underlying principle is clear. Compete where structural strength already exists, rather than where exposure is highest. And the key question remains open. Does this strategy increase confidence in Canada's direction, or does it still require proof through long-term delivery before confidence follows? That answer will depend on what is built next. Please leave your thoughts about this content in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.